connection. So hello everyone and welcome to the webinar. My name is Megan Spencer and I'm a Research and Communications Assistant for the POLIS Water Sustainability Project, which is based at the University of Victoria, and I'll be the host of today's session. So today's webinar, Evolving Watershed Governance in BC, New Research and Initiatives, is the fifth and final webinar in POLIS's 2015-2016 Creating a Blue Dialogue webinar series, which is closing off its sixth season. And I know some of you have attended our webinars in the past, but for those of you who haven't, I just wanted to give you some insight into the Creating a Blue Dialogue series. So its goal is to bring together water leaders and practitioners in one virtual space and to engage with emerging and priority issues in water policy and water governance. And in this webinar, as I hope you're all aware, our three speakers will highlight new research and initiatives aimed at improving capacity for watershed governance in BC. And we couldn't carry out this series without the support of our various partners. All of them are listed here on this slide, and I would like to say a big thank you to all of them for their core support to this series. And before I hand things over to the speakers, there's just a few housekeeping items I'd like to run through with you. So the first has to do with audio. So as I'm sure you've realized, I have a blanket mute on everyone. And that's just because we're expecting so many listeners. We just shouldn't have any audio feedback to distract us from the presentations, which might raise the question, well, how do we deal with questions? And I see that many of you are using the chat box in the bottom right corner of your screen. So after the speakers are finished presenting, that's where we'll handle questions. And I'll serve as the moderator and read them out as they come in, and the speakers will be able to answer them. And the final housekeeping item I'd like to go over with you is that now is a nice opportunity for you to introduce yourself in the chat box and maybe give a nice weather update from your region. It's just a nice way to get a sense of the community in the room. Since we're all scattered across the province, it's good to know who's in this virtual space. So if you could say who you are, what organization you're with, and how many folks are listening with you, that should help us feel a bit more like a community. And now I'd like to introduce today's speakers. So my colleague Natasha Overduin is joining us as a speaker today. And Natasha completed her MA in Water Governance last year through the University of Victoria's Department of Geography and WIGLAB while she was working for POLIS. And this past winter, Natasha coordinated 3 regional watershed governance capacity building workshops, and she's a contributing author on POLIS's new research report, Illumination, which she'll be speaking about today. And Teresa Fresco is also joining us as a speaker, and Teresa is involved in planning the Watersheds 2016 Forum along with POLIS and others, so we're happy to be collaborating with her again through this webinar. And Teresa is Assistant Regional Manager for the Fraser Basin Council's Upper Fraser region, and she's the coordinator for the Nechako Watershed Roundtable. And our third speaker today is Heather Leschied, and she's worked with POLIS on many initiatives in the past, so it's nice to have another familiar face or familiar voice on the call today. And Heather is Program Manager for Living Lakes Canada and serves as Chair of both the Kootenay Lake Partnership and East Kootenay Integrated Lake Management Partnership. So with that introduction to our webinar and to the speakers, it's my pleasure to hand things over to my colleague Natasha. So Natasha, you can just unmute your line and we can get going.
Perfect. Thank you, Megan. And thank you everyone on the line who's joining us. And a big thank you to Teresa and Heather. It's great to be speaking alongside you today. Today's presentation is going to have 3 parts. I'll be setting us up by first providing an overview of our newly released research report. So we'll talk a little bit about the impetus for the investigation and how we carried it out, and some of the major findings and conclusions around watershed governance trends. And we'll then kind of ground that bigger picture discussion by hearing from Teresa and Heather, who will tell us about the initiatives that they're working on and how some of these trends are playing out in practice. And then we will have some time for questions. And I'll apologize just right off the bat here. I am a little bit sick, so if I sound raspy or do a huge sneeze at any point in this presentation, I do apologize. This is the cover page of the new report. It's on our website. You can feel free to download it today. or at any time. The research was undertaken because we believe, and our research participants clearly believed as well, that watershed governance in BC is more timely than ever. And there's a host of contextual factors that are creating a real window of opportunity in BC to move forward with new forms of watershed governance. I won't spend too much time on that context, but just wanted to overview a few of the major changes, the first being that the legal landscape is changing with BC's new Water Sustainability Act, as well as Supreme Court decisions affirming Aboriginal rights and title. First Nations are asserting rights and leadership around water. We're seeing many different cases of that. And a large number of collaborative, community-based watershed organizations exist and are undertaking planning, monitoring, coordinating. There's a shifting really in how governments and organizations are seeing their roles and responsibilities. And of course, too, we're experiencing increasing water challenges. That was evident this past spring from extreme droughts and flood events. Climate change is ushering in a period of new normals, and there are increasing pressures that are highlighting some of the cracks in the governance system that need to be improved. Overall, I think there's a really strong understanding that we need to do things differently, and there's lots of recent research and events and initiatives exploring the concept of watershed governance, but there are still considerable knowledge gaps to actually turning the concept into practice. So this study is about illuminating those practical needs and the capacities required. It's dealing with the question of what do we need now to make watershed governance work in BC. So it's testing and confirming assumptions and laying out the core needs for progress. This was an extensive investigation. It used a whole research team approach. This group that you can see here worked together for over a year in collecting and analyzing the data. We used three primarily different research tools. There was first a series of interviews with key informants from diverse backgrounds. This helped us deepen our understanding and figure out the questions that we then asked through an e-survey. The e-survey went to close to 450 people who are doing work around water in BC, and you can see the sectoral breakdown there, wide diversity, the highest participation from local government, and input from all the main watersheds in the province. And then finally, there was a specific First Nations roundtable to better understand the needs and challenges faced by First Nations communities for strengthening watershed governance. Today I'll just share the top 5 research findings and insights, the highlights. The report contains considerable detail, though. For anyone digging into it, I think you'll find that it's really quite a thick report. And the intention was that we wanted to sincerely report on the data and on the perspectives and insights we heard. And again, I won't go into all of that today. The first insight, as I've alluded to already a little bit, is that our current system of governance needs improvement. And appetite exists for new approaches and for doing things differently at the watershed scale. The research confirms and also puts a lot of language around why the current system of decision-making isn't working. In short, there's agreement from all the sectors that the status quo is not equipped to deal with the complex water challenges we're facing, really modern-day realities, and that BC's water is not currently being managed to ensure its protection. You can see that in the pie chart on this slide. One of the themes that was put forward by respondents in the interviews is that decision-making is happening in the dark, that communities are reacting to crises instead of proactively being prepared to adapt to new realities. And in the First Nations Roundtable, it was very clear participants believe First Nations are not part of the current system of governance because it's consistently excluding and failing to recognize and respect First Nations laws, values, traditional governance practices, and knowledge. The Roundtable also expressed frustration with the fact that the current system of governance treats water and other natural resources as commodities. A complaint, too, that I wanted to mention was this idea that the province is seen to be retreating from its role and no longer has resources to manage water on its own. But that's contrasted, though, with the idea that watershed governance does not mean eliminating a role for the province, and on the contrary, 72% of our e-survey respondents agreed that the current approach to management decision-making would actually benefit from more provincial involvement and the necessary complementary resources. The second major finding we confirmed is that collaborative watershed governance is seen by participants as the future. Collaboration where decision-making is happening in partnership, meaningful partnership with First Nations and local governments, province, federal government, and collaboration around sharing authority, risk, and responsibility, and working with stakeholders and licensees. The third finding is that watershed governance happens one step at a time. We concluded that there are stages of development, or a spectrum, if you will, of how groups advance towards these sophisticated formal decision-making partnerships. That's illustrated in this diagram, which is understandably a little bit simplified, but I think shows that there's a progression, and that most often the starting point is with collaboration around projects like restoration or monitoring initiatives, where people are able to start to get to know each other and build relationships and trust and begin to see that there's a common appreciation for the watershed. And once those relationships have become established and there's a common understanding of the challenges and opportunities in the watershed to do things differently, local partners may begin formalizing and visioning to co-create a new vision for the future of the watershed. The visioning and project-based collaborations can then provide the rationale to develop a watershed plan that outlines milestones or actions that are required to meet that vision, and it might spell out some of the new responsibilities and roles for different organizations and agencies. In that fourth step then, with a broad base of support, track record of substantive work, and a clear watershed plan, a collaborative entity can be positioned to seek more formal agreements regarding sharing decision-making authority and financial responsibilities, and start to ensure that watershed plans are actually enforced. And this final stage is really the vision. When we're talking about doing things differently, this is the bold new idea that all levels of government are working together around the shared goal of a healthy watershed, guiding decisions or even making decisions, and understanding that issues are too complex for one party to do it by themselves. And I'd argue that in BC, most groups are in the first and second stages, as well as some in the third stage. And this research found considerable interest in moving up these stepping stones towards more localized decision-making. Fourth, and unsurprisingly, the study revealed a number of challenges and capacity needs. Communities to move up that ladder need support, and they're looking for that support to implement new approaches. And the report lays out a number of the challenges to achieving the vision of watershed governance. Some of these are high level. For example, we need a robust legal framework in the WSA, implementation of core elements of that legislation. We need recognition of First Nations rights, which is critical. It's hard to break away from the status quo, and political realities can slow things down. And then other capacity challenges are more related to those grassroots efforts of the groups who are working at those first, second, and third stepping stones. There are questions in collaborative organizations around how to share power and how to manage complex relationships and how to prioritize issues. I'll speak to that just a little bit more, because in addition to the Illumination report, over the course of the fall and the winter, we coordinated 3 regional workshops to build capacity around governance. And this also really was a ground truthing and a deepening of our understanding of what the capacity needs are and locally and how to address them. The goal of the workshops was to build this capacity and commitment, and really when I'm talking about capacity in this context, I'm talking about skills and knowledge, networks, the ability for an organization to strategically plan, prioritize, secure funding and support. Really, it's a preparedness, readiness, and effectiveness in contributing to watershed decision-making. These workshops were held in 3 regions, as you can see on the map there. The Coquitlam region was our first workshop with the Coquitlam River Watershed Roundtable. Coquitlam is a very urban area. Our second workshop was in the Mid-Vancouver Island region with a number of groups from that area. And Mid-Vancouver Island is a mix of rural, urban kind of setting. And then in the Columbia was our third workshop, Columbia being a relatively rural region, smaller, geographically dispersed communities, all with unique characteristics. And we'll be hearing from Heather today about some of the work happening around Kootenay Lake. These regional workshops really further situated the Illumination findings by confirming what's revealed in the report, that in watershed organizations, a better understanding is needed of the opportunities to engage and influence decision-making. Funding is needed, the long-term operational kind, is what I'm talking about here. Better relationships are needed with decision-makers, and human resources are needed. There's also a clear need for tools to help define watershed pressures. And Teresa today will talk about some of the work in the Nechako around defining watershed pressures. For example, in Ontario and in some places in BC, an approach has been to do a watershed report card, which helps define what the pressures are and their social implications. These kind of tools are really important for watershed organizations so that they can match problems and solutions with risk and their own capacity, and help clarify who needs to do what isn't happening, and what needs to happen differently. And in the regional workshops, as well as in Illumination, it's very, very clear that relationships, partnerships, and reconciliation between First Nations and non-First Nations is a requisite for watershed governance for any kind of co-governed organization. I think it's also really, really important to recognize that First Nations communities require space and support to determine their desired governance path forward and their own governance priorities. Nations have a number of legal and governance approaches available to advance their interests, exert authority, and change the governance landscape. That includes what's in the WSA, but it also includes strategic engagement and treaty, policy development and implementation, and so on. I think it's really important to understand that. So I'm getting to the end here. The fifth finding I wanted to highlight was that given the numerous capacity needs and challenges that still exist to advance towards this more sustainable, collaborative approach to governance, one of the goals of the Illumination study was to test if there was interest in the creation of province-wide infrastructure to promote and encourage and support the creation and implementation of watershed governance. So we were trying to scope what this infrastructure might look like, and we tested the idea of a province-wide capacity builder organization. We found general support exists for a province-wide capacity builder hub, kind of what I call it. 2/3 of the respondents in the e-survey said that they did see value, and only 8% said that they didn't see any value. And as you can see from the sectoral breakdown, there was fairly consistent support across the sectors, around 60 to 68, 70%. In terms of what a capacity building organization would actually do, that's something that we were testing and investigating, but it seemed there would be a role for an enabling organization versus a management institution. So the idea wasn't to create a new government agency or bureaucracy, wasn't the idea to have a new licensing organization, rather to have a center that could enable other activities at other scales and build bridges between scales so that there was better connection between a local watershed initiative and what's happening at the province level, for example. A capacity building organization could also be a repository of tools and resources. As the practitioners on the line today know, there are many different technical tools needed in decision making. There's different approaches to watershed report cards and so on and so forth. So having a central kind of library for these tools and resources was one of the potential functions identified. And also aid in collective learning. So something we hear all the time is that people are interested in knowing what their organizational partners are doing elsewhere. And that's partly why we're hearing from Teresa and Heather today. And there could be a role for a hub to help aid that. In terms of the organizational structure, the idea was that this would be an arm's length organization, but provincially supported with provincial role and involvement. And of course, it would be necessary for First Nations to lead the design of this so that it was suiting First Nations' own interests and needs. And there were some mixed feelings on whether or not an organization like this should have authority and decision-making responsibilities, and to what extent. So in terms of some next steps for this research, we're sharing the research now, and you'll see a number of media pieces around the Illumination report in the coming months, and today's webinar is kind of the first start in sharing the work. We'll be working on further fleshing out this idea of a capacity builder through an options paper, and we're working on informing other initiatives and groups. We'll also be supporting any kind of pilot initiatives that might come forward, or supporting groups who are experimenting with governance approaches. And all of this will inform, too, the Watersheds 2016 Forum that is happening in September, which will help build capacity for collaboration in watershed governance by bringing people together from across the province to have some of these critical conversations. And with that, I'll pass it on to Teresa and look forward to questions in a few minutes.
Hi, everyone. I'm hoping you can hear me. I'm new at the thing. So thanks, everybody, and good afternoon. Greetings from sunny Prince George and Kootenay Lake territory. It's really great to see a lot of familiar names on the line. Some of you I haven't spoken with in quite some time, so it's really nice to be here. So big thanks to the POLIS team for having me and to all of you for listening in. I wanted to build on some of what Natasha has been talking about and what POLIS has found in their Illumination report. And I wanted to provide you with a bit of a snapshot of some of the work we've been undertaking in the Nechako watershed over the last 4 years. So I'll be providing a bit of an overview of a new watershed entity that we have launched up here called the Nechako Watershed Roundtable, and a bit of a glimpse of some of the projects that we're undertaking with the Roundtable. So to start, I wanted to provide a bit of a geographic context for those of you that may not be familiar with this area of interior BC. The Nechako watershed is a major tributary of the Fraser River Basin, and it includes the Takla system in the north, Burns Lake in the west, the Utsa Lake system to the south, and Prince George at the eastern edge. And the Nechako meets the Fraser River at Prince George. The watershed is slightly larger than the size of Switzerland, so it's pretty big, and it encompasses several jurisdictions, which include 2 regional districts of Bulkley Nechako and Fraser Fort George, 5 municipalities of Prince George, Vanderhoof, Fraser Lake, Fort St. James, and Burns Lake, and the traditional territories of 14 carrier nations. The Roundtable isn't the first collaborative initiative in this watershed, and there is quite a legacy of collaboration in the region. Fraser Basin Council was involved years ago in helping to form and support the Nechako Watershed Council, which was a group that was active from 1996 to 2011. And following that period, we've helped to convene a diversity of decision makers and stakeholders that are still interested working together on watershed sustainability. And following the Watershed Council, there was a more informal group that called themselves the Nechako Watershed Alliance, which launched as the Nechako Watershed Roundtable more formally in October of 2015. The Roundtable's vision is to ensure the Nechako watershed is healthy for generations to come, and that this is achieved by protecting and improving the health of the Nechako and its communities. The Roundtable has 2 goals towards this end, which are to provide strategic direction and advice on stewardship, and to provide strategic advice and review the progress and development of projects and implementation of projects as well. Like many of the watershed entities across BC, the Roundtable doesn't have any delegated authority and is advisory in nature. And general membership to the larger Roundtable initiative is open to anyone, provided that they agree to the terms of reference for the group. The broader Roundtable is guided by a core committee, which is that smaller circle in the middle of the diagram on the right. And the core committee serves as an operational arm to help the Roundtable realize its vision through the advancement of projects. And the core committee has a very specific structure. Representation includes 3 local government reps, and currently we have 2 directors from the Fraser, Fort George, and Bulkley-Nechako regional districts. And formerly we had the president of the North Central Local Government Association. He's recently stepped down, so we are opening that 3rd local government seat to various local governments in the watershed. We have 3 First Nations reps. Currently, we have representatives from the Nakazali and Cheslata Carrier Nations and the Carrier-Sakani Tribal Council. And we have 4 NGO civil society reps, which include representatives from the University of Northern BC, the Nechako Environment and Water Stewardship Society, and the Fraser Basin Council. And currently, the Fraser Basin Council chairs the core committee, but we hope also to have a co-chair from one of the First Nations representatives in the future. And the role of Fraser Basin Council is also to serve as administrative and secretariat support, so my position as a coordinator. We also have a technical advisory committee to support the Roundtable, and this is a group of technical experts that can provide an advice and support for major projects. And one of the major projects that we're currently working on is the Nechako Watershed Strategy. So the technical advisory group for the strategy include provincial agencies such as the Ministry of Environment, representatives from Forest Lands and Natural Resource Operations, DFO, stewardship groups, the University of Northern BC, and industries such as Rio Tinto and Canfor who work in the area. So to get a better understanding of the state of the Nechako watershed, we did complete some work that led up to the strategy which we're completing now, and this work was a Nechako Watershed Health Report, and we completed that in 2015. The report collated and analyzed 20 primary indicators, and these were grouped into 5 thematic areas to assess watershed health. And these were water quality and quantity, fish and wildlife, ecosystems, resource development, and resource conservation. The purpose of this report was to assess the health of the Nechako watershed, identify areas of concern and highest priority areas for action, inform government decisions, stewardship activities, and restoration priorities, and of course advance public education and behavior change. To ensure the report was accessible, we also created an online atlas which puts the data from the indicators and information in geographically interactive format. And you can access this atlas online through the URL that you see above. Information in both the health report and online atlas established a pretty good baseline. As you can see here, this is we've opened up some of the folders that you would see on the online atlas just to give you a sense of the amount of information that we had in the health report and on the atlas. And it established a pretty good baseline to begin the development of the Nechako watershed strategy, which we are currently undertaking. The strategy has 3 aims. The first is to profile key watershed health issues and concerns. The second, to identify priority actions to address the issues and concerns. And thirdly, to identify commitments from various organizations and agencies to implement those actions. We've done quite a bit of work to date. As I mentioned, we established a technical advisory committee for the development of the strategy. We've collated a number of research and outreach projects to initiate the first phase of development and completed a first round of community meetings in Prince George, Fraser Lake, Fort St. James, and Burns Lake to ground truth our findings in our health report and atlas with observations and input from communities. And we're also having our first Nechako Watershed Roundtable meeting to update the public on the strategy on Thursday afternoon, as well as a technical advisory committee to start doing the next phase of development. So our next steps towards the completion of this strategy include doing another round of community meetings, hosting a broader roundtable meeting on Thursday. We're going to be incorporating feedback received from all the community meetings, which include meetings with various First Nations communities. We want to submit the draft of the strategy to our core committee for approval, and once approved, we will disseminate the final draft and start to initiate some of those short-term actions and implementation. And of course, for the next phase of the strategy, what's critical is that we secure funds for phase 2 implementation. So over the last 4 years, I've had the privilege of being involved in this project, and I believe that this group has accomplished a lot of work to date, and I'm pretty excited to see that it's come to this phase where we're able to develop and complete a strategy. We'll have this first draft. We're aiming to complete the first draft by August, so it's coming along quite quickly. But of course, there are still a number of challenges and opportunities that we continue to grapple with as a group. And the first is, Natasha had mentioned, sustainable funding mechanisms to continue the work. This is a pretty critical stage for the Nechako Watershed Roundtable in its initial stages of development. And in order to build the relationships needed for change, we need continuity of the process through the work of a coordinator like myself, or for another staff person to continue advancing the group's meetings as well as some of the projects. So we need sustainable funding mechanisms to do that. The second point, which is related to the first, is enabling First Nations engagement. As you saw, it's a huge watershed. We have 14 First Nations with traditional territories within the geographical boundaries. Ensuring that we properly engage these groups and enable their participation is a pretty big challenge with limited funding. And lastly, even if you're able to get consensus among all the various local interests at the roundtable, there are challenges with the realities of what this kind of group can influence. So for example, one of the big issues in the Nechako is the issues of flows. So there is a consensus among all the interests that flows are an important issue and that it needs to be resolved in the Nechako, especially as the climate changes. However, one of the challenges is that the dam that releases water into the Nechako is owned and controlled by a single industrial user. So of course, this also emphasizes the importance of building knowledge and capacities of decision makers on these issues through groups such as the Roundtable. And with that, that's a little bit of my 2 cents of experience. I'll turn it over to Heather to give us a little bit of a snapshot on the Columbia.
Great. Thanks, Teresa. I've just taken myself off mute, so I hope that folks can hear me okay. Yeah, so thank you so much to POLIS for the opportunity to speak this afternoon, and thanks also to everyone for joining in today's webinar, and also nice to see so many familiar names along there in the list of participants. And it's wonderful to hear from Teresa about all of the exciting work happening in the Nechako. There are so many opportunities for us to share and learn from each other, and so much great work happening across the province and the country. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about the work of the Kootenay Lake Partnership over the past 6 years. and give you some insights into our achievements to date and what our next steps are as a partnership. So the Kootenay Lake Partnership was formed in 2010 as a result of the clear need for coordinated, balanced management approaches that would sustain environmental, community, recreational, Aboriginal, cultural, traditional, and aesthetic values. The mission of the partnership was originally written and modeled after the East Kootenay Integrated Lake Management Partnership, which was formed earlier in 2006 by Fisheries and Oceans Canada. But the Kootenay Lake Partnership operates very differently. The Kootenay Lake Partnership is solely a multi-agency initiative, which means that it's completely government to government. It's local, regional, provincial, federal, and First Nations governments coming together to talk about management for Kootenay Lake for Kootenay Lake. The East Kootenay Integrated Lake Management Partnership includes not only government but also community watershed stewardship groups. So there's the key difference. Kootenay Lake is located in southeastern BC, for those elsewhere in the country. The major city center here is Nelson. Nelson has a population of about 10,000 people, and the broader lake community combined is about 60,000 people. Kootenay Lake is part of the Kootenay River system, which is a tributary of the Columbia River. The Kootenay River begins at its headwaters north of Kootenay National Park, just north of Invermere, and it flows south across the border into Montana, where the Libby Dam was formed was created in 1972 and formed the Koocanusa Reservoir. The river makes a bend north again and crosses the Idaho border near Creston, BC, where it becomes Kootenay Lake. It's a natural lake, but there is some water level control through operations at the Shoreline Dam downstream. So the geographic focus area of Kootenay Lake Partnership is very specific. We're looking at the lake, the west arm of the lake to Shoreline Dam, which is where Nelson is, the north arm of the lake, which extends to the mouth of the Duncan River, the south arm to the mouth of the Kootenay River near Creston. And then for mapping purposes, our area focuses on the foreshore to 100 meters inland, or to a logical break like the highway along the east shore or the railway along the west. The Kootenay Lake Partnership was brought together by Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and to a large extent is managed by the Regional District of Central Kootenay. Other key members of the partnership include the Ministry of Forest Lands and Natural Resource Operations through Lands, Water, Habitat Divisions, the Interior Health Authority, the Chinahua Nation Council, the Yakanuki or Lower Kootenay Band in Creston, the City of Nelson, and the Village of Caslow. The partnership includes both government staff and elected officials, which also makes it quite unique. So why does the Kootenay Lake Partnership exist? Well, Fisheries and Oceans completed a foreshore inventory and mapping project on the west arm of Kootenay Lake in 2004 and again in 2008. And now the west arm of Kootenay Lake is about 30 kilometers long, and it's the most heavily developed portion of the lake. Within that 4-year time frame, the level of impact significantly increased, the amount of land designated as urban residential increased, and there was a net loss of riparian vegetation. Also within those 4 years, over 300 new docks and groins were built on the west arm. So because of this increase in development, the Kootenay Lake Partnership was recognizing the challenges associated with overlapping and multi-jurisdictional responsibilities across government agencies and cumulative impacts raised specifically by the Yakanuki and Chinahua Nation about this increase, as a result of this increased development. So this has all led to the common story across many lake communities in BC and elsewhere in Canada, where we have conflicting policy, we have poor communication, uncoordinated efforts, we have a lack of regulatory compliance, and weak public education and guidance. And so I know that resonates with a lot of people, and which is why the Kootenay Lake Partnership was formed. And again, this is a common story. So all of this change has resulted in what we know to be long-term environmental damage to the foreshore. And the partnership wanted to improve what was happening around the lake. So the approach the partnership took was to complete a sensitive habitat inventory mapping project for the entire lake. So SHIM is comprised of a foreshore inventory and aquatic habitat index. And my apologies, the slide in the translation to the webinar, the slide text became a little bit jumbled, so I'll try to explain it. But the general idea is that there's ecological values which are comprised of what was completed as a foreshore inventory and aquatic habitat index. And then separate to that, there are significant cultural values, archaeological values and cultural values, which combined are the focus of the Ktunaxa Nation. And then thirdly, we have community values. What does the broader community see as important for the lake? And these are the main three pillars that we are looking at in terms of lake management planning, or whatever type of planning process will be appropriate. But today I'm going to focus on the ecological values and the cultural values. Together, these values will be presented through shoreline management guidelines. And these shoreline management guidelines will help to contribute to better understanding of the value of the shoreline and direct shoreline development to protect those values. The protocol specifically on the ecological side was developed by Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and it's been applied at 10 other lakes in the East Kootenay and elsewhere in the province, in the Okanagan, and the South Basin of Lake Winnipeg, as well as Lac La Biche in Alberta through the efforts of Living Lakes Canada. And as I mentioned, SHIM, or Sensitive Habitat Inventory Mapping, is just one component of a larger lake management planning process that identifies how our communities live, work, recreate, and develop in and around our lakes. And the Kootenay Lake Partnership has taken this unique approach to the federal protocol by integrating the cultural and archaeological values with those ecological values. And I should mention one of these 10 lakes that has had this work done is Lake Windermere, and I'm happy to see Megan, Talia, and Denise on the line here, who've been using the shoreline management guidelines on Lake Windermere now for the past 8 years. So to break down the process, the first step is the foreshore inventory mapping. This identifies land use, shore type, existing riparian condition, and anthropogenic alterations such as marinas, docks, or retaining walls along the foreshore. Based on this data, the shoreline is broken into a number of segments. The foreshore inventory mapping serves as a benchmark for regulatory agencies by documenting current foreshore condition. It also provides evidence for regulatory investigations through photo documentation, or in some cases, GPS video. And to give an idea of the scale of Kootenay Lake, the total shoreline length is 400 kilometers, and we identified 254 segments around the lake. Secondly, the Aquatic Habitat Index uses specific scientific analysis to identify zones of sensitivity and key habitat features, and it ranks those shoreline segments based on value. Fish and wildlife habitat and occurrence and aquatic invertebrate presence and absence data is collected during the summer and fall over a 1-year period using various field assessment protocols. The Aquatic Habitat Index quantifies the ecological value for each shoreline segment and also identifies the potential if alterations were to be removed. And this is really important because it provides an opportunity for restoration potential, identifying those areas that would see a significant increase in in ecological value if restoration were to occur. And lastly, again, the unique approach that Kootenay Lake is taking is the integration of archaeological and cultural values into the shoreline guidance document. The archaeological overview assessment details known archaeological and potential archaeological sites, and the cultural value study identifies and maps areas that have cultural significance to the Ktunaxa people. So cultural values might include things like kokanee, which might mean protecting spawning habitat or areas to access kokanee as part of the management plan. Another value might be gathering for medicinal purposes, and the strategy there might be to protect vegetation zones where medicinal plants are known to occur or survey areas where there is potential. In some cases, of course, cultural and ecological values overlap, such as the case with the Kootenay. And combined together, the survey will identify management strategies. To date, the Kootenay Lake Partnership has completed the ecological studies, the foreshore inventory mapping, the aquatic habitat index, and the Ktunaxa Nation has completed the archaeological overview assessment and the cultural values study. They were done, while they were done simultaneously, they were done separately on purpose to ensure confidentiality of the cultural data. And where we are today is the completion of the Shoreline Guidance document. It's been a long time coming. We're very excited now to see the report coming together and incorporating ecological, archaeological, and cultural values to develop a long-term vision for the lake. So to be clear, the guidelines that come out of this work essentially assess the level of risk associated with shoreline development and direct those shoreline activities such as docks, boat launches, retaining walls, to habitats or to areas of the shoreline of lesser ecological, archaeological, or cultural values so that those high value habitats can be protected in the long term. And really, we want to make sure that these guidelines are applied and used. And so a key piece of this work is the incorporation into local planning opportunities, such as official community plans that we have around the lake, or creating new zoning bylaws for specific areas of the lake. Other lakes in the East Kootenay have gone as far as completing lake management plans that incorporate these guidelines as well. We anticipate the document the end of June. So unfortunately, I'm not able to share those results with you today, but it will be going out to the community over the summer and fall for feedback. I want to mention our funders because I think it's a big, I think it's an important piece of how we operate. The wide spectrum of funding we receive really demonstrates the broad support that the partnership receives from all levels of government, foundation grants, of course, and then local industry, which has been very important. I also want to acknowledge that we collaborate with and we support the Friends of Kootenay Lake, who are focused on the stewardship activities. They're focused on community events, restoration, water quality monitoring, and citizen science. And while we don't do any of those activities, we support them. And we understand that the Friends of Kootenay Lake represents a broader interest of the lake community as a whole. The Friends of Kootenay Lake are currently undergoing a community values survey, which will gauge what matters to residents and visitors and help to achieve that, the community aspect of further planning for the lake. Moving forward beyond the completion and incorporation of the Kootenay Lake Shoreline Guidance document, the partnership has identified additional issues that would be appropriate for such a collaboration to undertake, such as addressing aquatic invasive species, cumulative effects monitoring, compliance and enforcement, of course, of the Shoreline Guidance document, further understanding fish populations, as we currently are seeing a significant decline in our kokanee population here, and clarity for and enhancements of water level management that happens on the lake. These are complex issues, and the fact that we have engaged agencies through the Kootenay Lake Partnership, we're excited because we understand that we've created the platform to seek solutions and that we have that opportunity here with the Kootenay Lake Partnership. And with that, I thank you for your time and look forward to some questions and dialogue. And I also want to say thanks to
Heather. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, Megan. I see Holly has posted the link to the Friends of Kootenay Lake Community Values Survey. So thank you very much, Holly, for pointing that out.
Yeah, that's great. And just with the resources from Teresa as well, I can send out a list of resources and materials that have been shared today for participants if they're interested in reading those and following up. So yeah, we'll move into our question period now. So for our participants, I'd invite you to type your questions into the chat box, and I can direct them to Natasha, Teresa, or Heather. And we'll just give it a few moments for questions to appear here. Okay, so we've got one here from Laurel Eaton asking, can you talk a bit more about how you established consistent long-term funding for this project? And I'm thinking she's directing this to Heather. So Heather, just more about the funding that you've been working for this project.
Yeah, that's a great question, Laurel. And I have to say that we haven't secured long-term funding for the project. Because the partnership has been, quite specific to working on the Shoreline Guidance document, that's really where our funding has been focused. We do, through strong relationships with some of the foundation funding, like the Real Estate Foundation of BC, who's actually funded much of this work in the East Kootenay as well, and I have to really acknowledge their support. And the Vancouver Foundation, we've been able to, through the successes of this type of project elsewhere, we've been able to secure support here. I think, with that said, though, I do think because of the strong relationship we have with the Regional District of Central Kootenay, we acknowledge that we have some core funding in the long term. And it's because they recognize the application of this work in their local planning process. So it essentially helps them do their work, which is wonderful. But past completion of the Shoreline Guidance document and integration of it, we don't have identified long-term funding.
Great, thanks, Heather. A good question here from Rosanna Bridal. I think also for Heather. She's asking, what difficulties have you had or what goals do you have regarding cross-jurisdictional collaboration? So for example, with the province of Alberta or Washington, Idaho, Montana.
Sorry, just thinking about.
I can repeat that if you want.
Well,
yeah,
I see the
take your time
here. So the difficulties that we've had is mostly around government agency overlap and responsibilities. And prior to the creation of the Kootenay Lake Partnership and also the East Kootenay Integrated Lake Management Partnership, there was not an opportunity for the government agencies that have responsibility for implementing things like the now Water Sustainability Act, the Fisheries Act, other pieces of legislation. There wasn't that opportunity for them to get together at a table and talk about issues in the region. And so I think that's been a huge benefit to forming these groups, the Kootenay Lake Partnership and the East Kootenay Integrated Lake Management Partnership. So those were some past difficulties, was just lack of communication and lack of understanding how the various policies and pieces of legislation apply at the local level on the ground. I don't know if that helps to answer your question. I think it's definitely, and maybe, maybe Teresa has some insight there as well.
Yeah, Teresa, if you'd like, you can jump in and talk about some of the cross-jurisdictional challenges that you might have encountered in your work.
I'm just giving that some more thought. I mean, we're a newer group, and so of course the cross-jurisdictional issues are there. And I think one of the ways that we've tackled that is through continuous communication through the various committees of the Roundtable that meet more frequently, and trying to get representatives from each of those jurisdictions that I pointed out, the local, regional contacts, the provincial contacts, and the federal contacts. And it's definitely through our development of the strategy and the those stakeholders or those representatives being on our technical advisory committee, I mean, it remains to be seen how we're going to address some of those cross-jurisdictional issues. I think what has helped is the mapping out of who does what in the watershed. And I think that's a really good tool and process to have in any kind of development of a strategy or plan, because you can better coordinate the different kinds of activities that you're responsible for, and sometimes look at areas where you can partner or maybe share resources or funding.
Great, thanks, Teresa. And I see you've listed out your funders there that support your project, so folks can read through those.
Yeah, my apologies that I neglected to put that slide into my presentation, but if people were wondering who's funded this phase of our work, that's there.
Yeah, that's great. So we have a question here from Robin Skeet. I'm not sure who she's directing this to, so maybe we can pass this one over for now, but I'll read it out. She's asking were economic models explored in the studies to provide long-term funding, for example, urban stormwater utility and taxation or water quality trading and frameworks. So Robin, perhaps you can just clarify who you were directing that question to, and we'll come back to that. But for now, we have one here from Han Schreer, directed to Heather, asking, is there a local septic system or issues with that on the Kootenay Lake, and how was the lake fertilization program incorporated into your study?
Excellent question, Hans, and hello. So in terms of local septic system issues on Kootenay Lake, it's definitely acknowledged that they exist. I think because of the size of the lake, it's more difficult to monitor for. The lake is significantly bigger than any of the lakes that we've worked on in the East Kootenay. The lake fertilization program is a really important piece. I learned yesterday that Kootenay Lake is the most heavily managed lake in the province. I don't know what, based on what type of level of analysis, but I think it's largely because the lake itself is managed in terms of water levels, and then we have a really large fertilization program because of the dam at the Duncan River, which means that the level of nutrients in the lake is artificially low, and so the province undertakes a fertilization program. We haven't incorporated that into our study. We're focused right now specifically on the Shoreline guidance document and shoreline development, and how we can better direct that. So these are big issues and need to be tackled, and I'm grateful also for Friends of Kootenay Lake and the water quality monitoring that they do, and they do that largely in partnership with the province, and that's so that there's not overlapping effort. The province does undertake a water quality program, monitoring program on the main lake because of that fertilization program, but not on the West Arm where there's higher level of development. And I think there was a question earlier from Jessica about how we divide the responsibilities. And that's really, the Friends of Kootenay Lake are the local stewardship group to do the restoration, the water monitoring, the community outreach, whereas Kootenay Lake Partnership is really where the government policy comes into place. So we work very well together, but we acknowledge that we're very separate in how we operate. So thank you for that question, Hans. And it's definitely, they are two very important issues and something that we haven't yet been able to tackle.
Great, thanks, Heather. So we'll just circle back here to that question I read out earlier from Robin Skeets. So she clarified this is for Heather. So I'll read it out again. It was, were economic models explored in the studies to provide long-term funding? And then she gave the example of urban stormwater utility taxation or water quality trading frameworks. But she did say that, you could speak to the broader kind of issue of finding sustainable funding for these initiatives in the province.
Yeah, great question.
I can speak to that one if you'd like, Heather, for a minute.
Yeah.
Not about the Kootenay Lake experience specifically, but it's a great question, Robin, because I think it was really clearly illuminated in our report that long-term core funding is an issue for most watershed organizations. I mean, Teresa mentioned that too, and what we saw in all the workshops that we did. So, I mean, a couple things. The first is just that the flip side of the funding coin, if you will, is the need for the relationships with some of the core partners. And I think what Heather was demonstrating here with the Kootenay Lake Partnership is that they work very closely with local governments. The work is a huge value add for local governments. So there's a more natural kind of funding relationship that can emerge there. Economic instruments, I think, can be potentially useful. Sometimes, potentially in an urban setting. And there's been quite a bit of investigation on this question of sustainable funding by the Fraser Basin Council. They have a report on their website that outlines a whole number of different mechanisms and tools for funding. And there's actually a specific initiative called the Sustainable Funding Task Force that's doing quite a bit of research into this question of how to ensure that watershed organizations have the financial support they need to carry out their work. I hope that answers the question. I don't know if Heather or Teresa, you wanted to expand on that a little further from your own experience, but I wanted to kind of, at a high level, it's a very relevant question.
I could expand somewhat on that. We're very fortunate in the Columbia Basin to have had the foresight, I think about 8 years ago or so, to start investigating the idea of taxation for funding conservation. And that was done through the Kootenay Conservation Program, which is a broad partnership of a variety of conservation organizations. And as a result of their efforts, we actually held a referendum in the, it was included in the local government election a number of years ago in the Columbia Valley to create a Columbia Valley Local Conservation Fund. And so this fund goes to broad, as I said, a broad spectrum of conservation work, but it can also support watershed management. Water's identified as one of the 3 key pillars. And recently, the same fund was passed in the Kootenay Lake area. So we're really thrilled now to have 2 local conservation funds. It's not a large amount of money, and by no means is it long-term funding, but it's dedicated funding through taxation, which is really exciting.
It's Teresa here. So I've put a link in the chat box to our financial mechanisms and models for watershed governance paper, which is accessible through our website. And actually, Heather, we profiled that fund in our paper, as well as many other mechanisms that we did an analysis of various watershed groups over time and really analyzed what kinds of financial models and mechanisms they were using, and that was one of them. One sort of context piece regarding the question about stormwater utility taxation and water quality training frameworks is those are really good when you're looking at municipal areas within watersheds. But in the case of the Nechako watershed, for example, I guess the challenge with that is a good portion of our watershed are rural areas and electoral districts. And so different watersheds will have different geographic contexts, and so the tools through which you use to finance the work will be different depending on the percentage of rural to urban. Just that I throw that out there as a context piece.
Great, thanks, Teresa. So we'll move on here. We have a question from Maxine Laker. This is directed both to Heather or Teresa, but it might be a bit challenging to answer, so if you need to skip over or have a think, that's all right. She's asking, did either of you have a situation where there was a lack of trust between community groups and elected officials because of political acts in the past? And if so, how did you rebuild that trust?
Teresa here. I noticed that there are some Nechako watershed folks on the line, and definitely they could weigh into this conversation. But in the Nechako, there are definite past decisions and tensions with elected leadership in the past and breaches of trust. There's definitely that part of the story in this watershed. Something that we found is having a facilitator or facilitative organization. It just so happens Fraser Basin Council is one of those. It definitely helps to address conflict We have a long history of being the neutral facilitator and mediator in these kinds of situations, so having a group like that, or a hired facilitator, or someone in the communities that could act as a facilitator, it helps, especially when you're getting these collaborative groups together with a variety and diversity of different representatives from different jurisdictions. Getting everyone at the same table, and then having the facilitator there, it helps to create a better and shared understanding of what some of the issues are. And it gives the space for people to be able to tell their story and vent if that's necessary. And the facilitator can work to create some ground rules through which that group can have that conversation. And so it's that piece of building a transparent process which is critical. And another sort of context piece in the Nechako watershed, there, as I talked about in my presentation, there were predecessor organizations that actually had really good representation across different interests in the watershed, and that legacy of collaboration in Nechako was actually quite critical for this new iteration of collaboration that we're doing now with the Roundtable, because the same agencies are participating, but it's a new generation of representatives. So the kind of conflict baggage is not as present as it was in, say, the past initiatives. So that's something interesting if you're taking a sort of historical perspective. So even though certain actions of a former group may not have come to fruition, the process through which they took getting these different groups together had impacts in the long term, such as now with the same agencies being willing to participate, but less baggage around conflict.
And I could just add, it's Heather here, the point that Teresa made around transparency for us has been really key, because we definitely have had conflicts, mostly in the East Kootenay, but where we've been able to overcome that is ensuring that we engage everybody from the beginning, and so making sure the government is involved, community is involved right from the start, and so they understand the process of the science, and this is of course specific to the shoreline sensitive habitat inventory mapping work, but then we're able to build that trust for the science in the beginning and have everybody involved, so that regardless of what the outcome is, there is that level of trust to avoid any conflict.
Great, thanks Heather and Teresa. So just being conscious of the time here, we have a question from Rosanna Bridell. I think that'll be our last question, so we've got a few to get to that. We'll start with a question here from Nathaniel Lewis George that's directed to Heather, saying, given problems with enforcement of regulations, who do you think is best positioned in your circumstance to carry out enforcement and maintain shoreline integrity? So giving the example of federal, provincial, First Nations, who is best positioned to carry out enforcement?
Good question. I appreciate that the Kootenay Lake Partnership includes all levels of government, and certainly it's the responsibility of everybody to enforce their own mandates and to enforce the shoreline management guidelines where appropriate. What I really appreciate about the approach here is that these guidelines become embedded within local government policy, and it's those local government agencies and our elected officials who are on the ground who see changes in the shoreline and who are able to be local champions. So, responsibilities aside, I think that local governments are in a really good position to enforce the shoreline management guidelines through those local planning initiatives.
Thanks, Heather. And we just have a comment here from Rick Simpson that I'll read out. So just providing an example of one of the many worldwide long-term watershed governance and management initiatives, he says, is the Lake Champlain Basin Plan, which is transboundary between the U.S. and Canada. So I guess if folks are interested in that, they can look into that example. And we have a question here from Darwin Horning directed towards Teresa. Asking, one of the most significant issues in water governance that I have experienced is the reluctance of private industry to engage in any watershed planning process. And is this an issue in the Nechako plan? And if so, what strategies have you developed to address this specific and critical issue? It's a great question.
Yeah, thanks. I actually didn't know if we were going to get to Darwin's question, so I privately messaged him. But The short answer is that, yes, we have been able to engage industry. There are quite a number of different industries that are doing work in the Nechako watershed. We've been able to engage the forestry sector, the mining sector, and yeah, those are the two major ones that we've been able to engage. Now, of course, we're continually working as a new group to strengthen those relationships, but we've been quite happy that many of them are open to attending meetings and of course, being part of the strategy development process, which is super critical for them to be there. I think the strategy that we've had to just address making sure that they're engaged is ensuring that we identify who some of the key champions within those companies are. So, for example, we're lucky that we've had predecessor organizations at work in the Nechako watershed, so we're able to find out who was involved in that previous organization, and then maybe if they're still within the company, engage them and say, could you engage again, or do you have a recommendation of who we could talk to that could help us with the Nechako Watershed Roundtable projects. That's one strategy. Another one, I think that's probably the key one that we use, is just past engagement and going through those channels and identifying champions and engaging them directly.
I can add there too, if there's interest, there's been some good work done out of University of Waterloo, the water governance group there, that surveyed industries to find out what their interests were in participating in collaborative watershed governance, and they found that industries actually tended to be very supportive and interested in being involved because they saw it as a way of being able to build relationships and potentially also avenues to further their own agendas. So there has been some work done, but it's an area that there's been surprisingly little work done. That study is one of the few from the Canadian context that looks at how industry is engaged in watershed governance. And I think when you look at BC, there's some examples of how industries actually can be really important for providing some of the resources and funding to support the work. But that sometimes, too, it's just a challenge that the interests of a watershed organization might seem to those involved in the organization to be really diametrically opposed to resource extraction. So that can sometimes mean that industry isn't actually welcome or invited to collaboration. So that's just, I wanted to throw that in there as well.
Great, thanks, Natasha. I'll move on to one of our last questions here from Rosanna Brudel. She's asking, has there been any assessment of the regulatory tools needed to achieve the goals of watershed governance and implementation of proactive measures? So, for example, local bylaws, the WSA, DWPA, etc. Natasha, perhaps this is something you can speak to.
Sure. So POLIS recently completed a report that does an analysis of the Water Sustainability Act, but also looks at sort of the intersections between levels of government and the partnerships that are needed between local government. So that report includes an assessment and analysis really of the different strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and that are available within some of those tools. But if your question is around whether the organizations, Teresa and Heather's respective organizations have done that assessment, I don't actually know, and it's a good question.
Yeah, it's Teresa here, and Rosanna, that's a really good question and something we've grappled with with the Nechako Watershed Roundtable process. And actually what we're doing this Thursday, we have our first update on the Nechako Watershed Strategy Development. Our Technical Advisory Committee meeting will actually be focused on this discussion of what regulatory tools and requirements are in place and how do those align with what we're trying to achieve. So, for example, there are goals that Northern Health has around drinking water and making sure that water is drinkable in the watershed. Okay, well, what does that goal look like, and where are we at with that? And then is that goal enough, or do we need to go forward or go further with that goal? So we have to take stock of every aspect of watershed health and kind of dig into the tools that exist and the goals that have been created either by regulation or policies, And something that's also quite relevant out here is that at the provincial level we had the LRMP and SRMPs. How do some of the things founded in those old plans on the land base inform how we're going to go forward? So it's a really good question. We can get back to you guys about how that process goes because it's quite daunting.
And it's really great, Teresa, that the Nechako Roundtable is undertaking that assessment. One of the things that we found in our capacity building workshops that I mentioned, those 3 regional workshops, is that groups are not always doing that assessment and aren't aware of the different opportunities. Like, they're not necessarily asking that question of what's the best way to influence and engage. Is it through an OCP? Or is it through, working with stakeholders directly, water licensees directly on their water management practices on their farm, for example? Or is it through engaging with the province? So it is really, that's kind of the governance, that's where it all kind of comes to a head. So it's great that the Nechako is really digging into that.
We're trying. I mean, one thing I neglected to mention as well is, as part of maybe Rosanna's list, is in addition to regulations, plans, and those kinds of tools, you also have to look at how decision-making is made by permit holders on the land base. So forestry industry, for example, how do they determine what they're going to cut and when and replant when? And all of those kinds of understandings around the decision-making process is pretty key for a strategy, say, if you're going to, get involved in assessing, whether there's enough habitat for the fish or for wildlife. You have to understand those decision-making processes in order to engage properly.
Great, thanks Natasha and Teresa. So the last point that is more of a clarification here for Heather from Darwin Horning asking, does the Columbia Basin Trust provide funding for your initiative? So Heather, you can probably just type that into the chat box there. And yeah, I think with that, we will put a wrap on today's discussion. Just advance my slide here. So I want to say a big thank you to our 3 speakers, Natasha, Teresa, and Heather, for their expertise shared in their presentations in our question period today. And thank you to all of you for attending today's webinar. And we record all of our webinars and house them on our YouTube channel. And the link is just there on the slide. So you can view all of our archived webinars there. And I'll be circulating the link to this webinar once it's posted online, most likely in the next 2 weeks. And as some of you may be aware, we typically do 5 webinars, and each creating a Blue Dialogue season. As I mentioned in my introduction, this is the 5th and final webinar in our 2015-2016 season. We'll be in touch in September with information on our next series. And for those of you who don't get our webinar invitations and would like to receive them in the future, just send me a note. My email is ra@polisproject.org, and I can add you to our mailing list. And just again, I'd like to foreshadow the upcoming Watersheds 2016 Forum, which will be held September 30th to October 1st in Vancouver, likely of interest to many of you on the call today, and we have the details there on the slide. So if you just search for Watersheds 2016 Forum or hashtag Watersheds 2016 on Twitter, you'll come across our website and registration page. And our early bird rates go until June 30th, so you still got a bit of time to register and get a bit of a deal. And we do have special rates for nonprofits, First Nations, and students. And with that, I think we'll wrap today's discussion. So take care, everyone, and you'll hear from myself and the WSP team with follow-up results from this webinar in the next few weeks. So thanks.
Thank you, everyone. It was great to have everyone on board today.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.